Hello everyone, in this video we are going to be discussing a topic from Cambridge IGCSE Biology, the topic of characteristics and classification of living organisms, and this is part one of the subtopic concept and users of classification systems. All right, before going deep into this topic, it's first a good idea for us to understand this term classification. Now, what is meant by classification? Classification simply means grouping things. Or in this case, we're talking about grouping living organisms. So basically, since there are millions of species living on Earth, it's definitely a good idea to group them appropriately. So organisms are classified into groups based on the features that they share. Based on the features that they share with regard to their physical, genetic, and behavioral characteristics, organisms are put into appropriate groups. And this process of classification is known as taxonomy. Right, so taxonomy basically helps scientists to better understand the relationships between organisms and how they have evolved over time. All right. Now, when talking about classification, we talk about classifying species, right? What exactly is a species? How do we define a species? A species is defined as a group of organisms that can reproduce to produce fertile offspring. Now, this is a very important definition in biology, so please keep this in mind. Let's take a closer look at this. A species is a group of organisms that can reproduce among one another to produce fertile, viable offspring. So basically, the different species living on Earth were considered and they were classified into appropriate groups. Now, when talking about classification, there's an important scientist who contributed a great deal to classification, a Swedish scientist named Carolus Linnaeus. Now, Linnaeus, basically what he did was he classified all living organisms in a way that allows the subdivision of them into smaller and more specialized groups. So he introduced a successful system of classification. And after doing all this classification, he even went to the extent of assigning a scientific name to every organism. So every single living organism is assigned a scientific name, and this scientific name is made up of two parts. Now you can see over here, a scientific name is given. This is actually the scientific name of a human, which is Homo sapien. Now, Homo sapien, you can see very well that the scientific name always comes in two parts. The first part of this name is referred to as the genus name, and the second part of this name is referred to as the species name. So every single organism is assigned with a scientific name like this, which comes in two parts. So let's take a look at a few more examples of scientific names. This is going to help you all better understand this naming system. So I'm going to give you all three scientific names: the scientific name of a human, the scientific name of an animal, the Asian elephant, and the scientific name of a plant species. I'm going to give you the scientific name of mango. So for human, the scientific name is Homo sapien. For the Asian elephant, the scientific name is Elephas maximus. And for mango, the scientific name is Mangifera indica. Now, when I was writing these scientific names, did you all notice how I have underlined each name separately? And also how I've started the first letter of the genus name with a capital letter. So basically, for any scientific name, there are a set of rules that were assigned by Linnaeus, and we have to always follow these rules when writing down scientific names according to this binomial system. Right, so the rule, here are the rules. There are 4 rules. Rule number 1, the genus name is always first and the species name always comes second. So you can see that, right? In this case, all these names that have come first are the genus names, and all these names and the second part of these names are always the species name. All right, that's rule number 1. Rule number 2, when typed, binomial names are always in italics. If you happen to type these names out, you need to make sure that they are italicized. Like you can see over here, you need to put them in italics. Then rule number 3, if you happen to write these names, when handwritten, each of these names should be underlined separately. That's exactly what I did over here. I was writing them down, so I underlined each name separately. And the last rule, the genus name always starts with uppercase letter, just like I did. It always starts with an uppercase letter, while all letters in species names are in lowercase. All the letters in these species names are all in lowercase. These are the set of rules, and this is what we call the binomial naming system. Now, you might wonder, why is this called the binomial naming system? So basically, this word bi refers to the fact that every organism was given a name with 2 parts. So the word bi means 2, and that's why we call this the binomial naming system. All right. So I also mentioned earlier that Carolus Linnaeus introduced a successful system of classification, right? So let's take a look at his system of classification. This is called the Linnaean system of classification. So what he basically did was, he first took all organisms and he divided them into kingdoms. And then he considered each kingdom and he further divided the organisms into phyla. And then within a phylum, he further subdivided the organisms into classes. And then after classes, he divided them into orders, and then into a family, and then into a genus, and finally into a species. So this is the order that we refer to as the Linnaean system of classification. It goes like this: kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So it's important for you as a student to remember this hierarchy, to remember this order. So here's a little tip for you to remember this order. You can remember this phrase: King Philip came over for good spinach. So the K is referring to kingdom, P for phylum, C for class, O for order, F for family, G for genus, and S for species. This is the order, this is the hierarchy of classification introduced by Carolus Linnaeus. So that's the theory part of this this particular section. So now let's take a look at a few questions from the question bank. All right, so here's our first question. The binomial naming system contains 2 types of names. What are they? This is what we just studied. So the 2 names in the binomial system is definitely the genus and the species. So that's our answer. That's a 3. All right, let's try another question. So a collection of creatures capable of reproducing and producing fertile offsprings. Collection of creatures capable of reproducing and producing viable progeny is known as. Now, remember I told you all that when we were following the video that this is actually a very important definition, and this was the definition we learned for species. So this is basically describing a species. So our answer is answer number 1. So that's all for today. I hope you all got a good understanding on this subtopic. Stay tuned for the next video. Hello everyone. In this video, we're going to be covering a topic from Cambridge IGCSE Biology, the topic of characteristics and classification of living organisms. And this is the second part of the subtopic, concept and users of classification systems. Now, in our first video, we basically discussed about what classification is, and we discussed about the Linnaean system of classification and the binomial naming system and so on. And in this video, in the second part, we're going to be discussing about how classification systems reflect evolutionary relationships between organisms. So that's what we're focusing on over here. We're focusing on the evolutionary relationships between organisms, and this is an extended part. All right. Now, when we talk about classification systems, the aim of a successful classification system is basically to reflect the evolutionary relationships between the organisms within a particular group. Now, if you think about this scientifically, how is it that certain organisms share similar features? For example, if you consider the group of mammals, we know that all mammals, all these organisms, have bodies covered in hair and they feed their young from mammary glands. So how exactly did this come about? How did all mammals get these common characteristics of being able to feed their young from their mammary glands and their bodies being covered in hair? How did these common features come about? So basically, the answer is this. It is that all these organisms, all these mammals, they share these common features because all these organisms have descended from a common ancestor. So organisms share features because they originally descend from a common ancestor, right? So in the case of mammals, it is believed that all mammals descended from a common ancestor that lived about 200 million years ago. So all mammals are related because they share this common ancestor. All right, now when talking about classification systems, originally organisms were grouped, organisms were classified using morphology and anatomy. So based on their form and their shape and their internal body structures, organisms were put into different groups. But now, as technology advanced, microscopes, knowledge of biochemistry, and eventually the DNA sequencing allowed us to take this classification, take this grouping system into a more scientific approach. So what is done now is that the DNA sequences of different species are considered, and the more similar the base sequences are in the DNA of two species, the more closely related these two species are. So here's what is being done now. You are considering the DNA base sequences, and if the base sequences are more similar to one another, if they are more similar to one another, we say that these organisms are more closely related to one another. That is the modern system of classification. That's what is being done now that technology has advanced and DNA sequencing of every organism is being done. So we consider these DNA-based sequences of every organism, and the more similar these DNA-based sequences are, we say that these organisms are more closely related to one another. All right. So let's take a look at an example, which is given here in the next slide. So given here are the DNA-based sequences of a few vertebrates. You can see that they've given the base sequences of the mouse, rat, human, pig, dog, chicken, frog. This is just part of their DNA, right? So all these organisms, we know these are all vertebrates. Right? These are all vertebrates. Now, if we consider the mouse and the rat and the human and the pig and the dog, we know that these are all mammals. And if we consider the chicken, we know that the chicken is a bird. And if we think about the frog, we know that the frog is an amphibian. All right. So we're just going to look at the DNA-based sequences of these 5 mammals, of the bird, and of the amphibian, and we're going to come to a few conclusions based on these DNA-based sequences. All right. Now, the DNA-based sequences here show that the mouse, rat, human, pig, and dog, these DNA-based sequences are very similar to each other. Just take a second to analyze this. You can see all these base sequences, they are all similar to all these 5 organisms. Similar base sequences all the way, except maybe at this point, there are few variations in the base sequences at one particular point. Apart from this, all the base sequences of all these mammals, and apart from this point and this point, all the base sequences are exactly similar. So very similar base sequences among these 5 organisms mean that these 5 organisms are very, very closely related to one another. And we know that, right? Because we know that all these 5 organisms belong to mammals. So can you see how the DNA base sequences reflect the evolutionary relationships? All these organisms who have very similar base sequences have evolved from a common ancestor, and they are all grouped with a group of mammals. And if you go on to, let's do a small comparison. Let's compare the DNA sequence of a mammal, let's take the dog, and a bird, which is the chicken. So if you consider these 2 base sequences, you can see that, yes, there are a few points where the base sequences are similar to each other, but there are more variations among these base sequences. You can see that, right? More variations. So more variations in their DNA-based sequencing means that they are more distantly related to one another. So this is exactly what we mean by DNA-based sequences can show how closely related organisms are. So the base sequences in a mammal's DNA are more closely related to all other mammals than any other vertebrate groups. All these mammals, their base sequences are more similar to each other, so we say that they are more closely related to one another than they are to the other vertebrate groups. So this is the theory of this section. Let's now take a look at a question from the question bank. All right, so here's a question from this section. It says that the chimpanzee and the bonobo are closely related species. What is the most reliable way of determining how closely 2 species are related? So it states that these 2 organisms are closely related, and they are asking you, what is the most reliable way for determining how closely the 2 species are related? So how do we determine how closely related 2 species are? Do we compare and contrast their anatomy? Definitely not. We don't consider the anatomical features. No. Do we examine their morphologies? Again, no, we don't do it based on morphology either anymore. Those are the traditional methods. Um, do we is it that other species evolutionary wise can be compared? Again, no, this is not the most appropriate answer. Or is it that we compare their DNA-based sequences? Yes, this is definitely how we determine how closely related they are. So the answer is definitely answer number 4. Compare their DNA-based sequences. So that's all for today's video. I hope all of you got a good understanding how DNA-based sequences determine how closely related two species are.